Today, we are returning to Final Fantasy character designs, with probably the most famous and recognisable design to come out of the series, which is Cloud Strife. Now, Final Fantasy VII is one of those games where you can pretty much take any aspect of it, hold it up, and say, this is what makes the game great. Whether it was the style and pace of the story, the unique world and environments, the materia and battle systems, all of these individual constituent parts were great in and of themselves, but somehow slotted together and ultimately created what several regard today as one of the best games ever made. And these brilliantly executed aspects of the game extend too, I think, to the character designs, and specifically Cloud Strife, because as the hero of the story and as the player character of that game, he really had the most responsibility for looking distinct, looking appealing, because he would be the player's avatar and window into events, and he would carry the emotive weight of that game throughout the adventure. And it's interesting to chart the evolution of Cloud's design, I think, because he's one of the few characters we get a real conceptual chronology of in Ultimania guides and bits like that, and where Square sadly don't publish too much of their early concept work or production notes, we do have quite a lot of material for Cloud, which shows not only the evolution of his character, but looked at another way, we could argue the evolution of game design and the evolution of Final Fantasy itself, since Cloud and Final Fantasy VII did of course represent this pivot and this leap from 16-bit 2D design to 32-bit 3D design, the transition from SNES to the PS1 and all of this sort of thing, and we will break that down and look at his design trajectory. So, jumping right in, I mentioned in my introductory video on Final Fantasy character designs that I did a few weeks ago, some of the standout contributors to the medium and the aesthetic of JRPG design, among which was Dragon Quest and Dragon Ball artist Akira Toriyama, and as stated in that episode, his contribution to the medium cannot be understated. He has a very distinct style that bridged manga and chibi designs with the world of JRPG game design, and his style slotted in perfectly with these 8-bit and 16-bit era titles, where the disproportionate eyes and expressively large heads of characters helped convey emotions on those smaller screens and those early games. And I raise this here because even as far forward as Final Fantasy VII, traces of Toriyama's pioneering work can still be glimpsed in the concept art, not least in Cloud Strife. Second to this, Final Fantasy VII and Cloud Strife's design is significant as the breakout game for Tetsuya Nomura, who had graduated by this point from debugging and monster design credits in Square games. He'd had a bit of input on the character designs of Final Fantasy VI, which was an ensemble effort by a lot of the leading team at Square, and then he graduated to full-on character design in Final Fantasy VII, which brought a distinctly, I want to say, modern style, not as a disrespect to the artists that came before, like Yoshitaka Amano or Toriyama, but modern in the sense that Nomura was designing his characters with a higher fidelity, the infamous belts and braces and accessories and so on, all this detail and shading and the like, in part because of his artistic approach, but also in part because these things could plausibly be rendered in the actual game now that we were on the PlayStation 1, and what we have here is a period between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X where there's a sort of graceful degradation in how characters are rendered on the screen, depending on what view we have. So FMV cutscenes are the highest quality, and these sort of taper down in the details down to the field screen and the overworld, which are more reductive views where only essential elements such as Cloud's shoulder pauldron and spiky hair are going to be rendered on those more minimal screens. So basically Nomura was designing with all of this detail because it could actually be translated into the actual game, particularly when we were getting to those FMV and higher quality scenarios. Now, looking to Nomura's early work on Cloud, who is without doubt in his final iteration one of the most iconic character designs in Final Fantasy, or indeed we might argue video game history, the earliest published concept art depicts a Cloud Strife which is much more comparable, I think, to Toriyama's style of design, with one or two distinctive spikes on his hair which accent a slicked back hairstyle. And actually, we see a lot more roundness of his head. This is something that we actually see in a lot of Toriyama's work, such as Goku from Dragon Ball, and even predating Toriyama, we have pioneering anime figures such as Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy. What we also see in Nomura's early iterations is a more compressed and topologically distorted Cloud that sits rather uncomfortably, I think, somewhere between a chibi-style design and a more figurative design. And you can almost see here the evolution and the conflict within the design approaches, because they were moving out of this 2D pixel character era and exploring how these characters might otherwise be realised on more powerful technology and, of course, within 3D space. And actually, Tetsuya Nomura has stated that Final Fantasy VIII is much more of his purist style, like his personal style, which was way more figurative, and actually the most figurative character designs of the PS1 titles. So we can almost see here, if we look back at Final Fantasy VII compared to Final Fantasy VIII, how the character designs were almost an intersection between Nomura's favoured approach and the future of this figurative design that we now operate in with all the Final Fantasy games, and the games that had come previously, which were much more, of course, compressed, abstracted chibi designs. And what's most interesting is that the characters did get both high-fidelity figurative designs and high-fidelity chibi designs in FF7, owing to the fact that Nomura needed to account for the characters, how they appeared on the field screen, as well as how they appeared more figuratively on the battle screen in the FMV sequences, and so on. So, coming to Cloud Strife proper now, and how his design iconically distinguishes him as the face of Final Fantasy VII, we'll start first with the hair and work our way down, because the hair is perhaps the single most defining feature that Tetsuya Nomura gave Cloud. It was this all-round asymmetrical spiked haircut, which inches up into a large single spike and then down into a series of others that frame the character's features really well. And such was the subtle balance and arrangement of Cloud's facial features that, whether intentional or not, it actually maps very neatly onto models that measure aesthetic balance, such as the golden ratio, otherwise known as the golden spiral. And this is a geometric model that has long been adopted by artists, architects, and critics to suggest harmony and beauty and balance in a given piece of work. Whether that's Hokusai's Great Wave or whatever, there's myriads of paintings that have had this model applied to them. And the arrangement of a piece of work that follows this spiral inward, drawing the eyes into particular details and features, it actually maps really neatly onto not only Cloud's face and his facial portrait, but also the full body design of Cloud as well, with the long legs that inch up into the detailed accessories and all of the stuff that's in the top third of his design. So this is simply a great example of the subtle balance and harmony in Cloud's layout and his facial features that Nomura designed here. And I think what distinguishes him that much more, aside from the arrangement and how that was done, is the fact that he is blonde-haired. And while this may not seem that outlandish today, having blonde-haired protagonists crop up in various Japanese media, whether that's Naruto, even later Final Fantasy games like Tidus in 10, Zidane in 9, at the time it was actually quite uncommon, and designs were much more rooted in a Japanese stylization, Japanese sensibilities, whether that's Xenogears or Dragon Quest or whatever. And more often than not, blonde characters or red-haired characters were sort of kooky secondary characters that would make up a fellowship or a certain sort of archetype within a manga or anime. And if I remember rightly, I think Tetsuya Nomura purposefully designed him that way to create a clear distinction between hero and villain, with Cloud's short spiky hair contrasting with Sephiroth's long straight hair, which drew those immediate and obvious visual comparisons there. So Cloud really broke the mold here, and I think started a journey that still persists at Square, which is adding a more westernized design to their characters. And indeed, an addition to the concept art team in recent years has been the Italian artist Roberto Ferrari, who was hired specifically by Square to bring those Western sensibilities into the Final Fantasy games and the character designs, starting with Final Fantasy XV. And actually, if we compare Noctis, who was designed by Nomura, and Ardyn, who was designed by Ferrari, we can definitely see those respective aesthetics shine through. Although, personally, I always loved the weird hybridization of a Japanese artist designing their impression of a Western type, because it really comes through in characters like Tidus and Noctis, and I think has a very unique sort of Final Fantasy vibe there. But I digress. So, back to Cloud Strife, and moving more broadly on from the hair and the face portrait. Perhaps the next starkest attribute to Cloud's design is the iconic Buster Sword. Not just the Buster Sword in and of itself, which is a great weapon with this narrative and growing characterization of its own, really, but the proportions of the Buster Sword compared to Cloud himself, who is this skinny-armed, though athletically built character, nonetheless wielding a sword that is almost basically his own size. And this juxtaposition between character and armament make a fantastic first impression. It immediately crafts a sense of fantasy, yet for Cloud himself gives a hint of inner strength and competence that such a slight character can lift the weapon with ease and gaze stoically out at the viewer from his concept art as if it were nothing at all. So I love the proportional considerations of Cloud, also his spiky hair, and actually how these attributes of his design inform his perception and dialogue and characterization in the game. For example, one of the most standout examples is Barrett frequently commenting on Cloud's spiky hair or how skinny he is with these humorous insults, making the game aware of Cloud's uniqueness and the perception of others within the game world. So that was great. Coming on to attire, much like how I discussed Lightning's design, Cloud also wears a militaristic uniform, in this case a soldier uniform, which has a sparse utilitarian feel to it, particularly the plain baggy trousers, which are almost like abstracted paratrooper pants, and these flare out and then taper down to his boots. And as mentioned, Nomura tends to decorate and detail the top third of his characters, and so what we have here towards the top of Cloud's uniform is an array of belts and braces and accessories that again lend themselves to the impression of utility and action, and perhaps the most standout and often discussed of these is the shoulder pauldron, which, along with the hair and the sword, is probably the third most distinct aspect of Cloud's design, and one of the key elements of design that actually carries through and gracefully degrades down to the field screen view. And the pauldron, along with the studded braces and the wraps along Cloud's forearms, they lend to this aesthetic that I touched on in my general character design episode, which is this distinctly sci-fi or cyberpunk vibe that Final Fantasy VII has, and this roughshod reclaimed metal accessorization not only unifies the central cast, because most of them, whether it's Barrett or Tifa or Cid, whoever, have similar kind of metal additions to them that visually join them together, but it also grounds each of these characters in the uniquely science fantasy world that has dystopian cities like Midgar and Junon in it. And without these metal accessories, Cloud may well look like he belongs in a more conventional fantasy setting rather than one inflected with technology and industrial social decline and that sort of thing. So although the accessories are very subtle, I think they are fantastic and really polish off this character and lend to the world that he is inhabiting. Now, coming on to later editions and iterations of Cloud, we firstly have Kingdom Hearts, which was a non-canon and I think much more symbolic, metaphorical representation of Cloud, with the solitary wing mirroring Sephiroth. He has this cloaked face mimicking Vincent Valentine and aesthetically conveying these regrets and misgivings that this version of Cloud has, and a lot of fans are either pro Kingdom Hearts Cloud or dead against it, citing it as an example of Nomura gone wild. Personally, I didn't mind it at all. I mean, it's so far removed from the canon that it almost didn't matter, but I do question the practicality of wrapping a Buster Sword up in bandages. Further to this, we have the Advent Children version of Cloud, which was, obviously, this is canon, it's much closer to the chronology and the narratology of the main FF7 story. And in here, we have an equally dour-looking Cloud, who has adopted a very lone wolf persona, and this is carried through aesthetically by the Fenrir symbol that he has in that film. But on top of this, he has a much more cloaked appearance. He wears these long sort of shawl-like cloaks. Actually bridges him very aesthetically with Sephiroth, weirdly enough, and a lot is done post Final Fantasy VII to sort of amalgamate these two characters, whether aesthetically or psychologically, trying to convey that. Again, going back to Kingdom Hearts with the One Wing, which is mirrored by Sephiroth and stuff like that. But in and of itself, the cloaked appearance, as mentioned in my Lightning episode, I think is further evidence of Nomura entering his everyone gets to wear a cloak phase, which started with Auron in Final Fantasy X, and he just seemed to love giving characters cloaks. But again, I quite liked the refinements of Cloud in Advent Children. They didn't take liberties or reinvent the wheel with the essentials of his design, and I think that's what's most important. He retains the soldier pauldron, for example, the hair, the high-collared top, and the only true overhaul was the modernised Buster Sword, which was the fusion sword. And this narratively replaces Zack's sword because that has become a grave marker on the outskirts of Midgar. So really, Advent Children Cloud is fundamentally consistent with the Cloud that we know and love. It was simply adapted to the state of Final Fantasy's world after Meteor Fall. So there we have it, a short look at the iconic design of Cloud Strife, what makes him work, and what makes him, I think, one of the most popular Final Fantasy protagonists of all time. For those interested, I do have an episode dedicated to discussing Cloud as a character, his narrative evolution, like why he works narratively, and I'll drop a link to that. But aside from that, thank you for listening. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on Cloud Strife's design.